American English, American English, American English webinar series. Teach and learn. American English webinar series.
Hello and welcome everyone to American English Webinar Series 3, brought to you by the American English team at the U.S. Department of State here in Washington, D.C. Do you have a photo of teachers viewing an American English webinar? We would love to see teachers learning together. We unfortunately did not receive any viewing group photos after our last session, but would love to see more from you. The picture shown here is not a viewing photo, but it is a great example of the kind of pictures we're looking for. You can submit photos like this one shown here by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@elprograms.org, and we may feature them in the next webinar. My name is Katie, part of the American English team, also known as Moderator Katie, and you'll see Moderator Amy here in the chat box as well to help you during the webinar. Here you can see the exciting schedule for this series. Our next webinar will be on June 29th, and it's entitled Using Group Work Effectively to Increase Student Speaking Time in Class, presented by Rebecca Wilner. As you know, our webinars are each 60 minutes long and related to a theme found on the American English website. The Teacher's Corner section from the website shown here features resources and lesson ideas related to this month's topic, and the theme for June is Common Challenges in the English Language Classroom. New activities are coming each week. And you may notice that the American English website has a new organization scheme. The Teacher's Corner can now be accessed in two ways, from the rotating feature at the top of the home page or through the English Teaching Resources section. Next, let's look at how you'll participate in the webinars. During these webinars, you will hear but not see our presenter, and the way for you to participate is by typing in the chat box, as many of you are doing now. The chat box is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. We may not be able to answer every question during the session, as there are often hundreds of teachers participating. However, there is another place to ask questions after the session is over, the Ning community for teachers, which we'll look at in more detail in just a moment. The presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These multiple choice questions will appear on the screen for you to answer. And some people may experience technical problems during the webinar. We will let you know if we are having a global problem, but if you do lose sound, you can follow along with the caption pod if refreshing your internet browser doesn't correct the problem. Each webinar series consists of 6 webinars. During the series, webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of 6 webinars receive an e-certificate from the Regional English Language Officer or local U.S. Embassy after the series ends. To ensure you're eligible for the e-certificate, we'll ask you to submit your attendance at the very end of the webinar. At the end of the webinar, you'll click on a link that will list for you, and you'll go to something that looks similar to this list of questions here on the slides and fill out the requested information. We know that many of you are already familiar with our Ning site, but if you haven't already registered, please do join this dynamic online community for EFL teachers. It may take up to 72 hours for your Ning registration to be approved. And here you can find resources and discussion questions related to each webinar, as well as all of the webinar recordings and featured materials. The Ning is also where you can ask presenter questions after the webinar and live chat with fellow community members. Do you teach large classes? Do you have students from multiple levels in the same course? Are you looking for ways to address the issues in your classroom? This month's Teacher's Corner is about common challenges in the English classroom. The article provides strategies for managing large classes, effectively teaching students from multiple levels, and working with limited materials. Find out how learning teams, teacher-led groups, and learning stations can help you address the different needs in your classroom, and discover strategies that don't require a lot of materials or preparation, and even some free resources that you can easily use in your own classroom. And now for today's webinar, Student-Centered Classroom Management, Addressing Classroom Issues with 5 Adaptable Forms. Old ideas about what a well-managed classroom looks like might make people think of students sitting at their desks quietly while a teacher delivers a lesson at the front of the room. However, many teachers know that this is not the most engaging or effective way for students to learn. Thankfully, we can implement structured, engaging activities that get our students more actively involved in the learning process. This webinar will describe classroom management and student-centered classrooms before discussing 5 adaptable forms participants can use to manage activities in their own classrooms. The presenter will explain how and why to use each form, and the forms will be made available to all of you on the Ning, and additional classroom management resources will also be discussed. It's my pleasure today to introduce our presenter, Catherine Thomas. Catherine has a master's degree in TESOL from Columbia University in New York City. She's been teaching English since 2001, and she was an English language fellow in Chile from 2008 to 2010. Catherine divides her time between Chile, where she is a consultant teacher trainer, and New York, where she is an ESL instructor at Baruch College, a public university with one of the most ethnically diverse student bodies in the United States. So welcome, Catherine. We're excited to hear what you have for us today.
Thank you for your introduction, Kate. Welcome to Webinar 3.4 of the American English Webinar Series. Hello, I'm Catherine, your presenter. It is a great honor for me to be able to share this webinar with you. Thank you for attending. Let's get started. Here is our agenda for today's webinar. First, we will define classroom management, and we will examine some typical classroom management issues. Then, we will consider 2 concepts that motivated me to create and use forms with my students. These concepts are student-centered classrooms and assessment. Next, we will look at several examples of adaptable forms and reasons why these forms are useful in addressing classroom management issues. Finally, I will recommend some additional resources. Here are 4 key words that are related to classroom management: control, discipline, organization, and supervision. Now, let's go to a poll. Which key words do you think of when you think about classroom management? This poll is multiple answer, so you can choose more than one word if you want. Also, you can type different words in the chat box. Well, it looks like organization is the most popular term when we think about classroom management. And also, following behind, we have discipline, control, supervision. Great. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas. I'm going to end the poll now. And coming back to the PowerPoint. Classroom management refers to the skills and techniques that teachers use to keep students organized, orderly, focused, attentive, and academically productive during a class. When we use classroom management strategies effectively, we can minimize the behaviors that impede or block learning for our students. And we can maximize the behaviors that facilitate or enhance their learning. To tell you the truth, classroom management can really be extended to everything that we as teachers do to facilitate or improve our students' learning. For example, our behavior, expectations, materials, and activities, as well as the classroom environment that we share with our students, are all important classroom management factors. So, how can we minimize the behaviors that impede or block our students' learning? And how can we maximize the behaviors that facilitate or enhance their learning? Here are 5 common tips or suggestions. The first 2 are obvious. Prepare well and arrive early. And be enthusiastic and positive. This is basic advice that any good teacher understands without needing to think about it. The next 3 tips also seem obvious. Establish clear expectations. Use engaging instructional methods. And encourage and reward participation. We know that it is important to do these things, but it is not always easy to figure out how to do them. What are some common classroom management issues that you face in your classrooms? Please type your response in the chat box. Too many students, I see. Aha. Passive students. Teacher-centered. No discipline. Many classes are large. Motivation. Chatting. Different levels, yes. Yes, low proficiency, lack of motivation, too many students. Great, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to continue now. Here are some common classroom management issues. In this context, when I say issues, I really mean problems. Because students can disrupt our classrooms when they exhibit these behaviors. Let's take a moment to review the broad categories of these behaviors. 1, off task. 2, inattentive. 3, noisy. And 4, hyperactive. Each category has some examples. Please take a moment to read the examples while you think about your classrooms and your students' disruptive behaviors. Now, let's go to a poll. Which broad category is common for you in your classrooms? This poll is multiple answers, so you can choose more than one category if you want. Also, you can type different words in the chat box. It seems like we're getting a lot of votes for inattentive. Yes, It's very difficult to hold our students' attention. Their attention spans seem to be too short. Also noisy, off task, hyperactive. But definitely inattentive is the problem we're struggling with the most. Okay, let's end the poll and go back to the PowerPoint. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it. One way to think about how we can minimize the disruptive behaviors that impede or block our students' learning is to think about the concept of student-centered classrooms. In your opinion, what does a student-centered classroom look like? Please type your response in the chat box. Alive, I like that. Students are active, Student autonomy, great. Fun. The teacher as a facilitator. Group work. Great. Fantastic. Proactive. I love that word. Engaging. Focused. Funny and fun. Engaged. Pair work. Dynamic. Collaboration. Oh, these are fantastic ideas. Really great. Thanks again for sharing. I'm going to move to the next slide now. The concept of student-centered classrooms is something that I think about a lot when I am teaching, because I know I have a tendency to dominate my classrooms. In fact, I think that teacher-centered classrooms are fairly common. Let's analyze the student we see in this slide. She has two spotlights shining on her. She is raising her hand, which indicates that she is ready and eager to participate. She has her paper in front of her, which indicates that she does her homework and brings her materials to class. She looks self-confident and engaged. Where is the teacher? How can we shift the spotlight from ourselves to our students? That's right, just do it. Shine the spotlight on your students. First, challenge yourself to remove the spotlight from yourself, the teacher, and shine it on your students. Think of this challenge as a gradual transition to a new teaching style. Perform the role of classroom facilitator. Try to be a facilitator instead of performing the traditional leader of the class role. Imagine that your main role is to help your students to perform in English. Encourage all students to participate. Provide tools that invite and reward your students' participation. The adaptable forms, which I will show you today, are examples of such tools. Support student-directed learning. Provide a structure or framework that supports your students when they prepare for class and perform in class. My forms are simple structures to support your students' self-directed learning. Another way to remove the spotlight from yourself, the teacher, and shine it on your students is to raise your hand, is to ask your students to work in pairs and small groups. Please raise your hand if you use pair and group work in your classrooms. Okay, good. Thank you. That's great. Now, I would like to briefly mention the term assessment, which refers to the methods or tools that teachers use to evaluate, measure, and document their students' learning progress. What types of assessment do you use in your classrooms? Please type your response in the chat box. Rubric, homework, essays, portfolios, quiz, peer, attendance, great, one-on-one, fantastic, oral, homework, formative, right, group discussions, summative, regular participation, observation. Okay, great, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to move to the next slide now. There are three main categories of assessment. Formative, which is relatively informal because it happens during the learning process. Performance, which is relatively formal because it evaluates a specific task or assignment, such as writing an essay or giving a presentation. And summative, which consists of formal testing at the end of a learning period to measure what a student has learned. Many of the adaptable forms that I'm going to show you today are useful for performance assessment. For example, evaluating your students' essays and presentations. Closely related to the term assessment is the term criteria. Assessment criteria are standards that indicate how a performance will be evaluated. We can also think of it as a sort of checklist. By performance, I mean a specific speaking or writing task, such as a presentation or an essay. One of the most important features of assessment criteria is transparency, which means that students know the criteria in advance. For transparency to occur, teachers need to analyze and communicate their expectations in advance before the students begin preparing their tasks or performances. Many of the adaptable forms I will show you today are useful for teachers who want to be transparent about communicating assessment criteria to their students in the form of a checklist. Now, let's go back to the agenda. Here is a review of what we have done so far. We defined classroom management, and we examined some typical classroom management issues. We also considered two related concepts, student-centered classrooms and assessment. As a teacher who was trying to solve classroom management problems in my own classrooms, I became interested in the concepts of student-centered classrooms and assessment. Exploring these two concepts motivated me to use forms with my students. So, I created 5 adaptable forms to help me manage my classroom, to make it more student-centered, and to create an efficient way of assessing my students. Now, let's look at the 5 examples of adaptable forms. All of the forms you are about to see are available on the American English webinar series Ning. Each form has 2 versions, PDF and Doc. I call the PDF version Print and Go because you do not need to make any changes before you print the form. You can just use the form as is. On the other hand, I call the Doc version Adapt, Print, and Go because you can adapt the form to conform to your own special needs before you print it. Here is the complete list of adaptable forms that I will share with you today. Assessment checklist forms, discussion preparation forms, interview forms, profile questionnaire forms, and reading journal forms. Let's begin with the assessment checklist forms. Remember that assessment refers to the methods or tools that teachers use to evaluate, measure, and document their students' learning progress. Before I show you an example of an assessment checklist form, I have a quick question for you. Do you ever ask your students to write essays? Please raise your hand if you do. Okay, great. Lots of hands are raised. Thank you. Here is a sample essay written by one of my writing students. Don't worry, you don't need to read the whole essay. But please, think about how you would assess or evaluate an essay like this. What factors do you take into account when grading an essay? Please type your response in the chat box. Okay, creativity, structure, mechanics, punctuation, organization, grammar, accuracy, writing skills, content, coherence, ideas, fantastic, pronouns, good, great. Thank you so much. Let's continue. So, let's imagine that you have asked your students to write an essay. This assessment checklist form indicates how the essay will be evaluated. It gives teachers a framework for communicating their expectations to students and for grading their students' essays. First, we see the assigned topic and the due dates. Second, we see the assessment criteria checklist. It may be difficult to see on this slide, but please remember that all the forms are available on the American English webinar series, NING. This form is very similar, but two forms can fit on one page because the form does not give the topic or due dates. Here, we can see the assessment criteria checklist more clearly. As you can see, each item is worth 10 points and the maximum score is 100 points. At the bottom, there is a place for teachers to write the total number of points and the corresponding grade. Here are just some of the requirements. State your introduction and conclusion clearly. Present enough examples and details to explain and support your key ideas. Use connecting words and phrases appropriately. Make sure that each verb agrees with its subject. Before I show you the next example of an assessment checklist form, I have a quick question for you. Do you ever ask your students to give presentations? Please raise your hand if you do. Okay, great. Lots of hands. Excellent. Now, please think about how you assess or evaluate your students' presentations. What factors do you take into account when grading a presentation? Please type your response in the chat box. Fluency, voice volume, composure, gestures, grammar, attitude, pronunciation. Great. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Presentation skills. Okay, let's continue. Now, let's imagine that you have asked your students to give a presentation and you have instructed them to give an informative presentation as opposed to a persuasive one. This checklist form indicates how the presentation will be evaluated. Here are just some of the requirements. Begin by greeting your audience. While you are speaking, try to make eye contact. Speak clearly, loudly, and slowly. Do not read your presentation. And illustrate your main points with at least 3 effective PowerPoint slides. This form is almost the same, but it is for a persuasive presentation. Before I show you the next example of an assessment checklist form, I have a quick question for you. Do you ever ask your students to write book reports? Please raise your hand if you do. Okay, let's continue. I'm not sure how many hands were raised in that case, but maybe not so many. In any case, if you do ask your students to write book reports, what factors do you take into account when grading a book report? Oh, I'm sorry, there were a lot of hands. I just noticed that. Okay, great. So how do you grade your students' book reports? Language, structure, summary, grammar, citation, great, critical analysis, references, the main point. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, here is the assessment checklist form for book reports. First, we see the instructions and the due dates. And second, we see the criteria checklist. Let's look at a version where you can fit 2 forms on one page. Here we can see the assessment criteria checklist more clearly. For example, respond to 3 of the following questions. What do you like about this book? What would you change about this book? Who was your favorite character? Why? What is the main idea of the story? Would you recommend this book to a friend? Why? Now, you have seen all of the assessment checklist forms. So, I have a quick question for you. Do you think any of these forms will be useful in your classrooms? Please raise your hand if you do. Oh, great. Lots of hands. Fantastic. Now, why do you think the checklist forms will be useful in your classrooms? Please type your response in the chat box. It will be easier for students to do peer feedback, to guide students, to make your judgment transparent, to be objective. Assessment. Great, much easier to assess, transparency. Wonderful. I'm very happy to see these comments. Okay, let's continue. So, why should we use assessment checklist forms? These forms provide a structure or framework to guide your students while they are preparing a performance. In other words, a specific speaking or writing task. The forms also provide a structure or framework to help teachers objectively assess and evaluate their students' work, give grades for specific performances, and monitor their students' progress. But before you can communicate your expectations to your students, you need to analyze and create a checklist. This is useful because it forces you, the teacher, to clarify your learning objectives for a specific assignment. Clear learning objectives support student-directed learning. And ensure transparency means that you can give the checklist to the students in advance before they begin preparing their performances, so they know exactly what they need to do to succeed. Okay, the next form or category of forms, discussion preparation forms. Remember that we are challenging ourselves. We want to try to shift the spotlight from ourselves, the teachers, to our students. To do this, we need to provide tools that invite and reward our students' participation, and a structure or framework that supports our students when they prepare for class and perform in class. How do you encourage your students to participate in classroom activities? Please type your response in the chat box. I'm going to continue with the PowerPoint as you type in the chat box. Imagine that you ask your students to think about one discussion question. This form is simple, but the activity is useful because the form gives students time to think and write a response before speaking with a partner or a group in front of the whole class. As you can see, 4 copies of the form can fit on one page because each form is small and does not have much text. Here is a sample form which was filled out by one of my writing students. In this case, the student responded to the question, what are 3 qualities of effective writing? I use this form to encourage students to brainstorm about a new topic. Using a form like this helps to slow the whole process down. It also invites every student to participate. Before I show you the next example of a discussion preparation form, I have a quick question for you. Do you ever have trouble knowing if your students really read the text you assign for homework? Please raise your hand if you sometimes have trouble knowing if your students really read their homework assignments. Okay, great. Lots of hands. Now, imagine that you ask your students to read a story for homework and to discuss the story in class. This discussion preparation form is for a reading response to a story. Let's zoom in for a closer look. Now we can see the reading response questions. What is the title, the main idea? What do you like? Which character or situation can you identify with? Here is a sample form which was filled out by one of my reading students. At the bottom of the form, the students select vocabulary words from the text and supply synonyms, antonyms, and fill in the blank sentences. This prepares students to play vocabulary bingo, which I will explain in a moment. Here is a sample form which was filled out by the same reading student. This vocabulary is coming from the same story. Now, imagine that you are teaching your students to write essays. As part of the process, you ask students to read a model essay for homework and to discuss the essay in class. Here are two versions of the reading response form. One has 4 questions and the other has 6. Let's zoom in for a closer look. As you can see, the questions are: what is the title, the main idea, the supporting ideas? What do you like? What would you change? How does the essay provide a useful model for your writing? And then the section at the bottom prepares students to play vocabulary bingo, which again I will explain in a moment. Now, you have seen all the discussion preparation forms. So, I have a quick question for you. Why do you think the discussion preparation forms could be useful in your classrooms? Please type your response in the chat box. While you're typing, I'm going to continue. So, why should we use discussion preparation forms? These forms provide a structure to prepare your students for classroom activities such as group work, pair work, and games. These forms allow you to communicate your expectations when you give students a homework assignment. The forms encourage students to think critically about what they read, and the clear prompts support student-directed learning. Ensure accountability means that you assign the homework. When you assign the homework, you tell students to fill out the forms and bring them to class. In this way, each completed form becomes a student's ticket to participate in the classroom activities. Now, I would like to explain why some of my forms ask students to choose vocabulary from the text they read for homework. If your students like to play bingo, please raise your hand. Vocabulary bingo is a fun classroom game that promotes learner engagement because the students choose the vocabulary words, create their own unique bingo cards, and invent the game clues using synonyms, antonyms, and fill-in-the-blank sentences. The rules are simple. You can find them with the bingo card forms on the American English webinar series, NING. The next item on the list is interview forms. Interview forms provide a structure or framework that supports our students when they are participating in classroom activities that require them to ask and answer questions, talk about themselves, and learn about their classmates. This particular form provides a structure for each student to interview one classmate with 10 teacher-created questions. I use this form at the beginning of a course, semester, or term. Let's zoom in for a closer look. As you can see, some of the questions are: what is your name? Native language, native country. What is your profession or field of study? Of course, you will need to adapt some of these questions for your context. Here are the other questions. What do you like to do in your free time? What is your favorite food, favorite place? How often do you go to the library? Why do you want to improve your English? And here is a sample form which was filled out by 2 students who were working together as a pair. As you can see, students can share a lot of information about themselves by asking and answering these questions. This is the one-question interview form. It allows each student to create one question and ask 5 classmates this question. As you can see, 2 forms can fit on one page. The form is simple, but the activity is fun because the students enjoy asking their classmates different questions, which are usually a lot more creative than my own standard questions. After the students write their questions, they get up and they move around the classroom. they get to choose whom they want to interview. And this activity promotes learner engagement because the students create their own questions and select the classmates whom they want to interview. Here is just a sample. In this case, the question is, what is your favorite color? What about you? Can you think of a question that you think your students would like to ask their classmates? Please type your question in the chat box. Favorite food, favorite artist, favorite weather, music. Yeah, why are you studying English? Writer. Great. Thank you so much. Great ideas. Okay. Now that you have seen both of the interview forms, I have another quick question for you. Do you think these forms will be useful in your classrooms? Please raise your hand if you do. Okay, great. Fantastic. And why do you think the forms will be useful in your classrooms? You can type your responses in the chat box. Yeah, more group work, communicative skills, interaction, structure, triggers students' creativity. Great, thank you so much for sharing. So, why should we use interview forms? These forms facilitate lively classroom activities that encourage students to share information, which is one of the most basic purposes of communication. This information can be shared during pair work, group work, and also the shared information can be used for fun games in future classes. This form allows you to learn more about your students, both in terms of the content of the responses and in terms of the level of each student's proficiency. Provide practice with questions includes asking and answering questions as well as creating questions. You can foster a sense of community by encouraging students to learn about their classmates. This helps to build trust, which allows students to feel more confident during speaking activities. The next item on the list is profile questionnaire forms. Profile questionnaire forms invite students to share information about themselves with their teacher. I like to use these forms at the beginning of a new course, semester, or term. The forms provide a structure or framework that supports students when they are introducing themselves to their teachers and thinking about their current language learning needs, goals, and objectives. This information gives the teacher a profile of each student and helps the teacher assess each student's language learning needs. Imagine that you are teaching a course focused on listening and speaking. Here is the form I like to use for listening and speaking students. Let's zoom in for a closer look. As you can see, some questions are, what topics do you like to talk about? Why do you want to improve your listening and speaking skills? What do you like to do in your free time? Here is a sample form which was filled out by one of my students at the beginning of a listening and speaking course. These are the questions on my form. Can you think of a different question you would like to ask your students? Please type your question in the chat box while I continue. At the bottom of the form, students are asked to do some self-assessment. Which aspects of English listening and speaking are most difficult for you? Please rate each aspect according to your needs. For example, expressions and idioms, formal presentations, grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary. In this sample, the same student is responding to the question, which aspects of listening and speaking are most difficult for you? Think about your students and the listening and speaking challenges that they face. Now, let's go to a poll. How do you think your students would answer this question for themselves? This poll is multiple answer, so you can choose more than one item if you want. Also, you can type different words in the chat box. Wow, it looks like the biggest challenge is expressions and idioms, followed by grammar. Yes, great. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Now, imagine that you are teaching a course focused on reading, the form on the left, or writing, the form on the right. Let's zoom in for a closer look. As you can see, many of the questions are the same, but here are two other questions I like to ask my new reading students. What topics do you like to read about? Why do you want to improve your reading skills? And then, which aspects of reading are most difficult for you? And please rate each aspect according to your needs. Now let's take a closer look at the form for writing students. In this case, what topics do you like to write about, and why do you want to improve your writing skills? And which aspects of writing are most difficult for you? And here we see some options: grammar, rules for capitalization, rules for punctuation, the process of writing, and vocabulary. Now, you have seen all of the profile questionnaire forms. So I have a quick question for you. Do you think any of these forms will be useful in your classrooms? Please raise your hand if you do. Okay, lots of hands. But why? Why do you think the forms will be useful in your classrooms? Please type your response in the chat box while I continue. So, why should we use profile questionnaire forms? These forms ask students to share information at the beginning of a new course. This allows you to learn more about your students, both in terms of the content of the responses and in terms of the level of each student's proficiency. These forms also support student-directed learning because they encourage students to think carefully about their learning goals and needs, as well as their personal interests. You can establish a foundation of respect by demonstrating your sincere interest in getting to know your students. This helps to build trust as well as mutual respect. In addition, the completed forms will contain important information that can guide you if you like to customize the course by adapting it to your students' needs and interests. The last item on the list is reading journal forms. When I teach reading courses, I ask my students to maintain reading journals. Each time they read a text, they have to fill out a reading journal form. For example, a text could be an article, essay, recipe, or story, or it could be a chapter from a book. Before I show you an example of a reading journal form, I have a quick question for you. Do you ever ask your students to maintain reading journals? Please raise your hand if you do. Lots of hands. And what are some requirements for a reading journal? In other words, what information do you expect to see in a reading journal? Please type your response in the chat box while I continue. This form is for students reading journals. There are two versions. One has 9 questions and the other has 7. Let's zoom in on the 9-question version. This form gives students a framework for recording information about and their responses to texts that they read as homework assignments. It encourages students to read a text carefully and think critically about what they have just read. As you can see, some of the questions are, what is the title? Who is the author? What is the source? For example, is the text from a book, magazine, newspaper, or website? When was it published? What is the main idea? As you can see, there are 4 additional questions. What do you like? What would you change? What would you like to ask the author? And what would you like to tell the author? Here is a sample form which was filled out by one of my reading students when we read an article in the New York Times. This section of the form helps students prepare to play vocabulary bingo. And here is a sample from the same reading student. Do you think reading journal forms will be useful in your classrooms? Why? Please type your response in the chat box while I continue. So, why should we use reading journal forms? These forms provide a structure to prepare your students for classroom activities such as group work, pair work, and games. These forms allow you to communicate your expectations when you give students a homework assignment, which is to read a text and to prepare for classroom activities based on the text. These forms encourage students to think critically about the text, and the clear prompts support student-directed learning. You can ensure accountability because each completed form becomes a student's ticket to participate in the classroom activities. Reading journal forms are similar to discussion preparation forms, but there is one important difference. My students are required to submit their reading journals for a grade. This allows me to develop a personal link or connection because I can add brief comments to some of their answers. I can imagine that some of you may be worried about the need for photocopies. For example, you may like the idea of using forms, but you do not have access to copies, or your access is limited. How can you distribute forms without making too many copies? First, try to fit at least 2 forms on one page. Sometimes you can fit 3 or 4 forms on one page. Here are some other alternatives. You can write the text on the board and ask your students to copy the text on their own paper. To give your students extra listening practice, you can first dictate the text before you write it on the board. You can also distribute the forms electronically via email or via free file sharing applications such as Dropbox. And of course, to reduce the number of copies, you can ask your students to work in groups and share forms with their group members. Can you think of other ways to reduce the number of copies? Please type your suggestion in the chat box. Great, thank you so much for sharing. I'm going to continue so that we make sure to finish on time. Here is a complete list of the forms. Now that you have seen all of the forms, please take a moment to think about your classrooms, your students, and whether any of these forms will be useful for you. Of course, you will probably need to adapt the forms for your reality. Now, let's go to a poll. Which forms will you try in your classroom? This poll is multiple answer, so you can choose more than one form if you want. Oh, great. It looks like you're going to try all of the forms, but especially the assessment checklist forms. Great, fantastic. And also the interview forms seem to be popular. Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing. At the beginning of this webinar, we defined classroom management, and we examined some classroom management issues. I created adaptable forms to help me manage my classroom, to make it more student-centered, and to create an efficient way of assessing my students. How do you think forms can help you with classroom management? And I'm going to continue so we be sure to finish on time. Forms can provide a structure or framework to guide your students while they prepare a performance or do their homework. They also can provide a structure to prepare for classroom activities such as group work, pair work, and games. In addition, forms can provide a structure to help you assess and evaluate your students' work, give grades for specific performances, and monitor your students' progress. Forms can allow you to communicate your expectations when you give students a homework assignment, which could be to read a text, or to write something, or to prepare a presentation. Forms can ensure transparency because they allow you to give students information about your expectations in advance before they begin doing their homework or preparing their performances. Forms can also ensure accountability. For example, when you ask students to read a text for homework, you can also ask them to fill out a form and bring it to class. Forms can facilitate classroom activities that encourage students to share information. This information can be shared during group or pair work, and the shared information can be used for games in future classes. Completed forms can also allow you to learn more about your students in terms of the content and also in terms of their proficiency. Filling out forms provides practice with questions, and completed forms give you important information that can help you customize the course. Forms can help you to establish a foundation of respect by demonstrating your sincere interest in getting to know your students. You can foster a sense of community by encouraging students to learn about their classmates. This helps to build group trust, which allows students to feel more confident during classroom speaking activities. You can also develop a personal link or connection if you add brief comments and praise to completed forms before you return them to students. Finally, forms can allow you to create clear learning objectives with assessment checklists. They also encourage students to think critically about text and to think carefully about their learning goals and needs, as well as their personal interests. For all of these reasons, you can depend on forms to support student-directed learning. The last item on our agenda is additional resources. And well, I want to share 3 articles with you, but they're on the Ning. Please go there and find these 3 wonderful articles from the English Teaching Forum. This article is one of the best articles I've ever read on the topic of classroom management. This article was written by someone who gave a webinar here in November 2015. You can find her materials on the Ning. And please read this article if you would like to learn about how to select more engaging reading texts for your students. Thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot about how using adaptable forms can help you implement student-centered classroom management. Thank you for deciding to invest your time in this professional development opportunity. I really enjoyed your participation, and I look forward to seeing you on the American English webinar series.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that great webinar on using student-centered classroom management. We all have some great ideas and insights and a lot of wonderful resources as a result, so thank you so much. And thanks to you, our webinar audience, for all of your great participation and thoughtful responses in the chat box and polls and raising your hand today. And we hope to see more of that discussion on the Ning. And don't forget to send in those webinar viewing group photos. We love to see your groups learning together. Our next webinar takes place at this same link on June 29th, 2016 and is entitled Using Group Work Effectively to Increase Student Speaking Time, presented by Rebecca Wilner. Thanks again for attending this webinar session.